The laughter of Judge Henry Miller echoed through the grand, oak-paneled courtroom like a sudden roll of Georgia thunder. It was one of those rare, uncontained bursts of mirth, the kind that escapes before a person of high standing can remember their dignity. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, his face reddening as he slapped his palm against the polished surface of the dark mahogany bench. The lawyers in the front rows, accustomed to his stern demeanor and sharp tongue, exchanged bewildered glances. The bailiff, a man named Benjamin with a back as stiff as a pine tree, stared toward the high ceiling as he always did when the judge veered off the tracks of formal protocol. And then there was the tiny girl in the pastel-pink dress, standing right in the center of the well of the court. She held a black smartphone to her ear. He as serious as a stone, completely oblivious to the waves of laughter and confusion she had just unleashed upon the room. She did not blink, nor did she waver under the weight of a dozen staring eyes. She was perhaps 4 or 5 years old, with her blonde hair tied into 2 bouncy pigtails secured by pink ribbons that swayed slightly every time she tilted her head to listen to the dial tone. There was an expression on her face that only children can truly master, the absolute, unshakable conviction that what they are doing is the most reasonable and necessary thing in the entire world. Her name was Mia, and she had just performed a feat of silent agility that would have impressed a seasoned spy. During a break in a particularly grueling custody hearing, she had slipped away from her grandmother in the gallery and approached Claude Foster, a 52-year-old attorney known for his expensive suits and cold efficiency. With the quiet grace of a shadow, she had lifted his phone from his coat pocket and retreated toward the judge's bench. She hadn't run or hidden. She had simply stood there and dialed a number with the calm deliberation of a master strategist. Judge Henry Miller had been the first to notice the movement out of the corner of his eye. He had watched the small human in pink navigate the sacred space between the public and the law. When he heard the faint digital beep of a keypad, he looked down over his spectacles. "What are you doing there, little lady?" the judge had asked, unable to keep the corners of his mouth from twitching into a smile. "Calling," she replied, but her voice small but remarkably steady. "Calling who?" the judge pressed, amused by the sheer audacity of the child. "Whoever I want," she said. And that was when the explosion of laughter occurred. That was when Benjamin sought solace in the ceiling tiles, and the lawyers realized the gravity of the courthouse had been momentarily suspended. Even Claude Foster, the owner of the stolen phone, opened his mouth to protest, closed it, and decided it was more prudent to remain silent in the face of such pure, childish defiance. "Call whoever you want," Judge Henry said, his voice still thick with amusement, as he wiped a tear of laughter from his eye. "Call whoever you want, little lady." He gestured with a wide hand, inviting the courtroom to witness the spectacle of a child exercising her right to speak. The room waited, caught in a rare moment of levity. But then the phone was answered on the other end, and the laughter died. It didn't die all at once, like a candle being blown out by a gust of wind. Instead, the mirth drained away like a fire being denied its fuel, slowly, as the judge realized that something profound was shifting in the air. Henry Miller's smile faded into a thin line, his bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline, and the entire hall, which a second ago had been filled with the most spontaneous joy those walls had heard in years, fell into a suffocating silence. Someone had answered, and the voice that came through the speaker was clear enough to vibrate in the stillness. It was a voice that Judge Henry Miller knew better than his own heartbeat. It was the voice of his daughter, Isabella. "Mia! Mia, baby, and is that you?" The name of the child, the voice of the woman who hadn't spoken to her father in over 2 years, the daughter who had moved to another state and blocked his number on every device she owned. The judge sat frozen, his hand still suspended in the air where he had been gesturing, like an actor who had suddenly forgotten every line of the play. The eyes of the room were now fixed on him as much as they were on the child. Isabella had told him, the last time they spoke, that she never wanted to see him again until he understood the gravity of his failures. Now, her voice was filling his courtroom, brought there by a child he barely knew. Mia held the phone with both hands now, her eyes fixed on the judge with a look of total, unwavering attention. "Mommy!" Mia cried out, and in that single word, and the courtroom understood that this was no longer a comedy. To understand what was happening in that Savannah courtroom on a Tuesday in October, one had to go back several years. One had to go back to Judge Henry Miller's private office on a sweltering afternoon in August, when the humidity was thick enough to choke a person, and the air conditioning had chosen that exact moment to fail. Isabella had been standing in front of the window, her arms crossed tightly, her face a mask of cold fury and exhaustion. At 31 years old, she was a respected pediatrician, but in that room, she felt like a child begging for a scrap of justice from a man who dealt in nothing but cold statutes. She had come back to her hometown to plead with her father about the custody of Mia. Her ex-husband, Robert, had been using the child as a bargaining chip, violating every agreement they had made, keeping the girl for weeks without notice, and refusing to answer calls. Henry had listened to his daughter with the same expression he used for every stranger in his court: closed, evaluative, and detached. When she finished, he had told her that the situation was delicate, that there were two sides, and that he could not take a side because it would damage his judicial credibility. He told her Robert was a man he had known for years in the legal community, and that things had to be handled through the proper channels. Isabella had stared at him for a long time, the silence stretching until it felt like it would snap. "You're telling me you won't help me?" she whispered. "I'm telling you that you need to follow the law, Isabella," he had replied. Sir, her voice had then cut through the heat like a shard of ice. "Mia is 3 years old, Dad. 3. She spent the last week sleeping in a car because Robert didn't pay the rent on the apartment he takes her to. 3 years old, sleeping in a car, and you're talking to me about channels." That was the day the silence began, the day she walked out and left him with nothing but his precious credibility. The silence of the last 2 years had been a heavy physical thing for Henry Miller. It started as a temporary rift, a stubborn standoff between a father who believed in the letter of the law and a daughter who believed in the spirit of protection. But as the months turned into years, the silence grew thick and calcified, and becoming a third person that sat between them at every dinner he ate alone and every holiday he spent in his quiet house. He had tried to reach out in the beginning, sending messages through a cousin, writing physical letters that were returned to sender, unopened and unread. He had felt the weight of that silence in his shoulders, a dull ache that followed him into the courtroom every morning. And then there was Mia. He had only seen her 3 times in her entire life. Once when she was born, once during a brief, tense visit before the rift, and once from a distance on a street corner, when Isabella had seen him and quickly turned the stroller in the opposite direction. The girl in the pink dress now standing before him was that same baby, grown into a small person with her mother's stubborn chin and her mother's fierce, unintelligent eyes. As Henry looked at his granddaughter, the realization began to dawn on him with the slow, agonizing crawl of a truth that refuses to be ignored. How did this child know to call this number? Why would Isabella's private cell phone number be stored in the contacts of Claude Foster, Robert's attorney? The answer to that question would take him the rest of the afternoon to fully piece together, and when he finally understood, it would change every assumption he had made about his life and his career. But for now, in the immediate present, there was only the sound of Isabella's voice and the sight of Mia, who was holding the phone out toward him. "Mommy, I'm in a big room," Mia said into the phone, her voice echoing. "There's a man in a black robe up front. He was laughing." She paused, listening to the frantic, unmuffled sounds of her mother on the other end. "He stopped laughing now," Mia continued. The courtroom, which had been silent, seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of silence that has a texture to it, dense, charged, and unforgettable. Henry closed his eyes for just 1 second. In that heartbeat, he wasn't a magistrate with 23 years on the bench. He wasn't the man whose reputation was feared by lawyers. He was just a 61-year-old man whose granddaughter was saying his name in a room full of strangers. When he opened his eyes, Mia was watching him. She didn't look afraid. She looked at him with that piercing, unfiltered evaluation that children use to judge the souls of adults. She didn't have the social graces to hide her curiosity or her judgment. She simply looked at him and decided what he was. "Oh, are you Grandpa Henry?" she asked. The question was a landmine. There was the legally correct answer, and then there was the truth. "I am," he said, his voice coming out more rugged and broken than he had intended. Mia considered this for a long moment, her pigtails bobbing as she nodded to herself. She turned back to the phone. "Mommy, it's him." There was another pause, a long stretch of electronic static, and the sound of someone crying softly on the other side of the country. "Yes? Okay." Mia extended the phone toward the judge, her small arm reaching across the gap between the child and the law. "She wants to speak to you." Benjamin the bailiff, who had been looking at the ceiling, suddenly found his own shoes very interesting and turned away toward the window. And the lawyers in the front row became deeply fascinated with their legal pads, scribbling nonsense just to avoid being witnesses to the human heart breaking open in public. Judge Henry Miller did something then that no one in that courthouse had ever seen him do. He descended from the bench. He walked down the 3 steps that separated his high seat of judgment from the level of the people. He moved with the deliberation of a man who knew he was walking toward a cliff and had decided to jump. He crossed the few feet of floor that separated him from the girl in the pink dress. He was a large man, his hair silver and his face lined with the stresses of 1,000 cases, and he knelt before her until they were eye to eye. He took the phone from her small, warm hand. "Isabella," he whispered. The voice that came back was hers, but it was different, deeper, more controlled, laced with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a war on too many fronts at once. "Dad," she said. Just that one word, but it contained 20 years of history. It contained the heat of that August afternoon and the coldness of the letters he hadn't been allowed to deliver. It contained the birthdays he had missed because he was too busy building a legacy of paper. "Isabella," he repeated, because it was the only word he had left in his vocabulary. "What is happening, Dad? Why is Mia in a courtroom?" And that was when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Henry looked out into the gallery, past the lawyers and the curious spectators, to a woman with graying hair sitting in the second row. See, she was clutching a large handbag and wearing an expression that was a volatile mix of guilt and fierce determination. It was Elizabeth, his ex-wife, a woman he hadn't spoken to since their own divorce was finalized years ago. She was the one who had brought Mia here. She was the one who had watched him from the shadows of the gallery, waiting for the moment when the man of law would have to confront the man of flesh and blood. "Isabella, what is this about a treatment?" he asked, his voice trembling. There was a silence on the other end, a different kind of silence this time. It wasn't the silence of anger, but the silence of someone deciding how much of their soul to reveal. "Cancer," she finally said. "Breast cancer, stage 2. I've been in chemotherapy for 4 months." The courtroom seemed to get even quieter, which Henry hadn't thought possible. He sat there, a judge on the floor of his own court, with his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the phone with both of them. "When were you going to tell me?" he managed to ask. "When you understood what was more important," she replied. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. It was the same thing she had said to him 2 years ago, but now it carried the weight of a life-and-death struggle. Mia stood beside her grandfather, watching him with a strange, quiet empathy. Children have a way of sensing when the adults around them are shattering, even if they don't understand the mechanics of the break. She reached out and touched the sleeve of his black robe, her small fingers tracing the heavy fabric. "Grandpa," she said softly. He looked at her, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't shed in decades. "Can you tell Mommy to come here?" In that moment, Judge Henry Miller made a decision that would likely be the talk of the Savannah legal community for the next 10 years. He looked up at Benjamin and told him to suspend the hearing indefinitely. He told Claude Foster and the other attorneys to wait in a separate room with their clients. He asked everyone else to leave the courtroom. When the heavy doors finally clicked shut, and the room was empty of everyone but him, Mia, and Elizabeth, Henry stayed on his knees. He opened his arms, and after a moment of careful evaluation, Mia stepped into them. She smelled like strawberry shampoo and the faint scent of crayons. She was small and light, but to Henry, she felt like the heaviest responsibility he had ever carried. And he buried his face in her hair and finally let the sobs come. Ugly, racking sobs that tore through his chest and laid him bare. Mia didn't pull away. She wrapped her tiny arms around his neck and waited with a patience that he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. The phone call was still active, the line open between Savannah and a hospital room hundreds of miles away. Isabella listened to her father cry, and for the first time in 2 years, the wall of ice between them began to show its first cracks. Life, Henry realized, was not like a court case. You couldn't just issue a ruling and expect the matter to be closed. Life was the messy, painful process of discovery, the long nights of testimony that didn't always make sense, and the realization that justice and mercy are often the same thing. Later that night, though after Mia had fallen asleep in a guest room at Elizabeth's house, Henry sat in his ex-wife's kitchen drinking a cup of coffee that tasted like regret. Elizabeth was a woman who solved problems with caffeine and silence, and she sat across from him, watching him with a guarded but not unkind expression. They had been married for 18 years before the career and the ego had pushed them apart. "You knew," Henry said, looking at the dark liquid in his mug. "I knew she was sick, yes," Elizabeth replied, "and I didn't tell you because she asked me not to. She wanted to see if you would ever look up from your bench on your own. She wanted to see if you even knew who your granddaughter was." Henry looked at his hands, the hands that had signed thousands of orders but hadn't held his daughter in years. "I failed her, Elizabeth. I failed them both." "You did," she agreed, offering him no easy comfort. "But you got off the bench today. That's more than most men like you ever do." Isabella called back around 11 o'clock that night. They talked for 3 hours. It wasn't an easy conversation. It was a brutal excavation of 2 years of silence and 30 years of neglect. Henry didn't try to defend himself this time. He didn't talk about his reputation or the proper channels. He just listened. He listened to her talk about the fear of the diagnosis, the sickness from the chemo, and the terror of Robert trying to take Mia away while she was too weak to fight. "I erred," he said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "Not just in August. I erred when I thought my legacy was the law, and not you. I built a name in this city and let my family crumble. And I told myself it was a fair trade because someone had to do the hard work. It wasn't a fair trade." There was a long silence on the other end. "I know you know that now," Isabella whispered. "But you always knew, Dad. That was always the problem. You knew it was wrong, and you did it anyway because it was easier than changing." The truth of her words stung, but it was a clean pain, the kind that precedes healing. He asked her about her prognosis, and she told him the doctors were optimistic. The stage 2 cancer was responding well to the treatment, and she had 2 more months of chemotherapy before the surgery. The chances of a full recovery were high, but the journey was exhausting. "I want to help," Henry said. "I don't know how, but I want to be there." Isabella didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't a wall. It was a bridge being built, one brick at a time. "Mia liked you," she finally said. "She called you because she found your name in Claude's phone. Do you know why your number was in his contacts?" Henry closed his eyes. "Because he's Robert's lawyer, and Robert is suing for full custody while you're sick." "Yes," Isabella said, "and the only reason she knew the name Grandpa Henry is because I never stopped talking about you, even when I was angry. I wanted her to know she had a grandfather, even if he was a man who lived in a stone building." The next morning, Henry went to the courthouse early, but not to sit on the bench. He went to the clerk's office and filed the paperwork to recuse himself from every case involving Robert or Isabella. And he knew that his involvement was now a conflict of interest, and for the first time in his career, he didn't care about the gossip it would cause. He then spent several hours in the archives, a dusty subterranean level of the building where the history of the county was stored in boxes and binders. He was looking for the records of Robert's past cases, looking for the patterns of behavior that he had ignored for years because Robert was a friend of the court. He found exactly what he expected: a trail of broken promises, unpaid debts, and a manipulative streak that used the legal system as a weapon against the vulnerable. Henry didn't use his power to change the files. He simply organized the truth so that whichever judge took over the case would see it clearly. While he was in the archives, he ran into an old man named Gerald. Gerald had been the archivist for nearly 30 years, a man who lived among the ghosts of old lawsuits and forgotten crimes. He watched Henry working with a quiet curiosity. "You're looking for something you can't find in a book, Judge," Gerald said, leaning against a stack of boxes. Henry looked up, his eyes tired. "I'm looking for the parts of the story I missed because I was too busy looking at the law." Gerald nodded slowly. "The law is a map, sir. But the map isn't the territory. Sometimes you have to fold the map up and just walk the land." He told Henry about his own children, 2 daughters and a son, and how he had missed their graduations because he was down here filing papers. "I thought I was being a good provider," Gerald said. "But children don't want a provider. They want a witness. They want someone to see them grow." Henry took those words with him when he left the archives. He realized that for 23 years he had been a provider of justice, but a witness to nothing. He had seen the world through the lens of a magistrate, categorizing people into plaintiffs and defendants, until he forgot they were human beings with hearts that could break. He walked out of the courthouse and stood in the small courtyard, looking at an ancient oak tree that had stood there since before the Civil War. Its roots were deep, gnarled, and hidden, but they were the only reason the tree could withstand the Georgia hurricanes. He realized he had spent his life polishing the leaves of his career while letting his own roots rot in the dark. He decided that day that he would retire at the end of the year, and he had enough of a pension, and there was a daughter in another state who needed a father, and a granddaughter who needed someone to read her bedtime stories. The weeks that followed were a blur of travel and transition. Henry flew to see Isabella 3 times during her final cycles of chemotherapy. The first visit was awkward and filled with the kind of tension that exists between 2 people who are trying to speak a language they both forgot. They sat in her hospital room, the hum of the machines providing a background for their tentative conversations. But Mia was there, and Mia didn't care about the tension. She demanded that her Grandpa Henry draw pictures of dragons and help her solve puzzles. She treated him as if he had always been there, with the effortless grace of a child who hasn't learned how to hold a grudge. And by the third visit, the ice had melted. Henry and Isabella found themselves laughing over a memory of a childhood camping trip, and for a moment, the hospital room disappeared, replaced by the warmth of a shared history that was being reclaimed. On the final day of his third visit, Isabella was resting after a particularly difficult session. Henry took Mia to a nearby park. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind where the sun feels like a warm blanket on your back. Mia ran through the grass, her energy seemingly limitless, while Henry sat on a wooden bench and watched her. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in decades. He wasn't thinking about his legacy or his reputation. He was just a grandfather watching his granddaughter play in the sun. Mia came running back to him, her face flushed and her eyes bright. She was clutching something in her hand. "Grandpa, look," she said, opening her palm to reveal a small, smooth gray stone. It was an ordinary stone, the kind you could find by the thousands in any park in the country. But to Mia, it was a treasure. "It's for you," she said, pressing it into his hand, "to keep you company when I'm not there." Henry looked at the stone in his palm. It was cool to the touch, worn smooth by years of wind and water. He realized it was the most valuable thing he had ever owned. It wasn't a trophy or a plaque. It was a gift of pure, unadulterated love from a child who had seen him for who he was and decided he was worth keeping. "Thank you, Mia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will keep it forever." He tucked the stone into his pocket, where it felt like a heavy, grounding weight. He looked at Isabella, who was walking toward them from the parking lot, looking pale but stronger than she had in weeks. She smiled at him, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes, and he knew that while they still had a long way to go, they were finally on the right path. The legal battle for Mia's custody eventually came to an end. With Henry's recusal and the evidence of Robert's neglect properly organized, a new judge, a woman known for her fairness and her focus on the welfare of children, ruled in Isabella's favor. Robert was given supervised visitation, but the primary custody remained with Isabella. The proper channels had finally worked, not because Henry had forced them, but because he had stepped aside and let the truth speak for itself. Isabella finished her treatment and went into remission, and the surgery was successful, and the doctors were confident that the cancer was gone. She moved back to Savannah to be closer to her mother and her father, and Henry found himself living a life he never could have imagined. His retirement was not a quiet withdrawal from the world. Instead, it was a grand entrance into a new one. He spent his mornings in his garden, growing roses and tomatoes with the same meticulous attention he used to give to his legal opinions. His afternoons were spent with Mia, picking her up from school and taking her to the library or the park. He became a fixture in her life, the man who was always there, the witness to her growth that Gerald had talked about. He taught her how to ride a bike, how to fish in the salt marshes, and how to tell the difference between a good story and a true one. And Isabella was there too, her health restored, and her relationship with her father rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and shared vulnerability. One Saturday morning, when Mia was 7 years old, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her grandfather, eating a bowl of cereal and coloring a picture of a sea turtle. She stopped and looked at him, her expression becoming that familiar, serious mask she had worn in the courtroom years ago. "Grandpa, do you remember that day when I called Mommy from the big room?" she asked. Henry smiled, the memory still vivid in his mind. "I remember it every single day, Mia." "Why were you laughing?" she pressed. Henry leaned forward, resting his chin in his hand. "Because I thought I was the most important person in that room," he said softly. "And you reminded me that I wasn't. You reminded me that being a grandpa is much more important than being a judge." Mia nodded, as if this was a perfectly logical explanation. "I'm glad I called," she said, returning to her coloring. "Me too, Mia, me too." As Henry watched her, he thought about the thousands of people who had passed through his courtroom over the years. He thought about the lives he had changed with the stroke of a pen, and the families he had impacted with his decisions. He realized that for most of those years, he had been a man of paper and ink, living in a world of abstractions. But now, he was a man of flesh and bone, living in a world of smiles and tears and small gray stones. He realized that the greatest judgment he had ever made was the one he made on that Tuesday in October, when he decided to stop being a judge and start being a human being. And it was a judgment that had saved his life, and the lives of the people he loved the most. The sun began to set over the marshes of Savannah, casting a long golden light across the kitchen. Henry stood up and began to clear the breakfast dishes, his movements slow but steady. He felt the weight of the years in his joints, but he also felt a lightness in his heart that he wouldn't trade for all the prestige in the world. He looked out the window and saw Elizabeth pulling into the driveway, coming over for their weekly family dinner. They were no longer husband and wife, but they were friends, bound together by the shared history of their daughter and granddaughter. They had found a way to be a family again, in a way that was different but no less real than before. Isabella arrived a few minutes later, looking vibrant and full of life. She hugged her father, a long, tight embrace that spoke of 1,000 unspoken apologies and 1,000,000 shared hopes. "How was she today?" Isabella asked, nodding toward Mia. "She's a genius, as always," Henry joked. "She's currently working on a masterpiece of a sea turtle." Isabella laughed, a sound that was music to Henry's ears. They began to prepare dinner together, the kitchen filled with the sounds of chopping vegetables and the smell of roasting chicken. It was a simple, ordinary scene, but to Henry, it was a miracle. It was the legacy he was finally building, one dinner and one hug at a time. As the family sat down to eat, Henry looked around the table. He saw Elizabeth, the woman who had never given up on him even when he had given up on himself. He saw Isabella, the daughter who had been brave enough to demand more from him than just a paycheck. And he saw Mia, the little girl who had stolen a phone and changed the course of history. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the little lady in the pink dress who had dared to call whoever she wanted. She had called him back to himself, and in doing so, she had given him the greatest gift a person can receive, a second chance to get it right. After dinner, as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky of Georgia, Henry sat on the porch swing with Mia. They swung back and forth in a gentle rhythm, the crickets providing a nocturnal symphony. "Grandpa," Mia whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Yes, Mia?" "I love you." Henry closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her small body against his. "I love you too, Mia. More than all the books in the world." He realized then that life wasn't about the grand proclamations or the high-profile victories. It was about these quiet moments of connection, these small threads of love that weave themselves into a tapestry of a life well lived. He reached into his pocket and felt the smooth gray stone. He had carried it with him every day for 2 years, a constant reminder of what was truly important. He realized that the stone was like love itself, simple, durable, and capable of being found in the most ordinary of places if you were only willing to look down from your high bench. He smiled into the darkness, a man who had finally found his way home. The judge was gone, but the father and the grandfather were finally, fully present. And as the swing moved in the quiet night, the Henry Miller knew that he had finally understood what it meant to be a man of justice. Not the justice of the law, but the justice of the heart. As we navigate the long, winding road of our later years, we often find ourselves looking back at the structures we built, the careers, the reputations, the houses, and the accolades. We tend to measure our worth by the height of the walls we raised and the weight of the titles we carried. But the true essence of a human life, the part that remains when the titles fade and the walls crumble, is found in the quality of the silence between us and those we love. For many of us, especially those of us who came of age, in a time when work was the primary definition of a man's soul, we often confused providing with being present. We thought that by building a name, we were building a future for our children, when all they really wanted was for us to look up from our desks and see them. We traded the messy, unpredictable beauty of family for the controlled, sterile perfection of professional success, and we called it a fair trade. But as the shadows lengthen and the noise of the world begins to dim, we realize that you cannot hug a reputation, and a legal opinion will never hold your hand when you are afraid. The story of the judge and the little girl is a reminder that it is never too late to descend from our own personal benches. We all have them, those high seats of judgment where we hide behind our pride, our grievances, and our proper channels. We tell ourselves that we are being neutral or principled, when in reality, we are often just being cowards who are afraid of the vulnerability that love requires. We wait for the other person to make the first move, to apologize, to break the silence, while the years slip through our fingers like dry sand. We forget that the most powerful thing we can do is to simply show up, to appear at the birthdays, to listen without judging, and to admit when we have erred. We forget that the proper channel for love is never a document or a protocol. It is the direct, unmediated connection between one heart and another. To the older adults who may be carrying a heavy silence of their own, let this be an encouragement. The walls we have built are not as thick as they seem. They can be breached by something as small as a child's laugh or as simple as a phone call. Redemption does not require a grand performance or a total erasure of the past. It only requires the courage to be honest about our failures and the humility to accept the grace that is offered to us. Sometimes we have to let our laughter die so that our hearts can live. Sometimes we have to lose our credibility in the eyes of the world so that we can find our dignity in the eyes of our family. The legacy we leave behind will not be found in the archives of a courthouse or the records of a company. It will be found in the memories of a child who knew that when they reached out, we were there to catch them. In the end, we are all just travelers looking for a place to belong, for a kitchen table where we are known, and for a porch swing where we are loved. The titles we held and the battles we won will eventually be forgotten, but the way we made people feel, the warmth of our presence and the sincerity of our apologies will echo through the generations. So, if you are sitting on a bench of your own making, look down. Look at the people standing in the well of your life, waiting for you to see them. Do not wait for a child to steal a phone to remind you of who you are. Descend the steps, open your arms, and realize that the most important thing you will ever do is not to judge the world, but to love the small corner of it that has been entrusted to you. For in that love, we find the only justice that truly matters, and the only peace that will ever follow us into the dark. It is the simple, profound truth that we are not defined by what we do, but by who we are to those who call us father, mother, or grandpa. And that, in its purest form, is the only legacy worth leaving.
Liam Carter had worked the night shift at Nexus Technologies for 3 years, and in all that time, he had never been summoned to the executive boardroom. So, when the security guard appeared at his workstation with a grim expression and told him the CEO wanted to see him immediately, Liam felt his stomach drop. He walked into that room knowing something was wrong, but he could not have prepared himself for what came next. Ava Sterling sat at the head of the long conference table, surrounded by board members in expensive suits, her face carved from stone. Liam stood before them all, his voice tight but steady, and asked the question that would change everything. "Why did you lie about me?" The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes shifted toward Ava, and for just 1 second, something flickered across her face that looked almost like fear. The night before had started like any other. Liam clocked in at 10 in the evening, nodded to the other technicians on the floor, and settled into his station in the server monitoring room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that familiar pale glow across rows of computer screens. He had been doing this job long enough that his body had adjusted to the inverted schedule, though his soul never quite had. Somewhere across the city, his daughter Chloe was being put to bed by his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher who watched her during his shifts in exchange for help with groceries and yard work. Chloe was 7 years old and understood more than any child her age should have to understand about sacrifice and making ends meet. Liam pulled up the system diagnostics and began his routine checks. The servers at Nexus Technologies powered financial transactions for banks across the eastern seaboard, which meant that any disruption could cost millions of dollars per minute. His job was to watch for anomalies, flag potential issues, and escalate anything serious to the on-call engineers. It was not glamorous work, but it paid reasonably well and offered health insurance, which was more than he could say for the construction jobs he had worked after his wife passed away 4 years ago. Cancer had taken her in 8 months, and it had taken everything from him except Chloe. She was the reason he showed up every night, the reason he kept going when exhaustion made his bones feel like lead. Around midnight, a notification popped up on his screen, a minor fluctuation in one of the backup servers. He logged it, checked the parameters, and determined it was within acceptable range. Standard procedure. He made a note in the system and continued his rounds. What he did not know was that 3 floors above him, in the executive suite that never seemed to sleep, a much larger problem was unfolding. The primary transaction server had experienced a critical failure, one that would result in a 6-hour outage and cost the company an estimated $12 million in lost revenue and client compensation. Liam learned about the outage the next morning when he was getting ready to leave. The day shift supervisor pulled him aside with a strange look on his face. There had been an incident, the man said, a major one, and somehow Liam's name had come up in the preliminary report. Liam felt confusion wash over him like cold water. He had not touched the primary servers. His job did not even give him access to those systems, but the supervisor just shrugged and said that was all he knew, and that Liam should probably expect to hear from Human Resources soon. He drove home in a daze, the morning sun hurting his tired eyes. When he picked up Chloe from Mrs. Patterson's apartment, she ran into his arms the way she always did, her small body warm against his chest. "Daddy, you look tired," she said, studying his face with those perceptive brown eyes she had inherited from her mother. "I'm okay, sweetheart," he told her, forcing a smile. Just a long night. They stopped at the diner on Maple Street for breakfast, their Saturday morning tradition. Chloe ordered pancakes with extra strawberries, and Liam nursed a cup of coffee while she chattered about her week at school. But his mind kept drifting back to what the supervisor had said. His name in a report about a system failure he had nothing to do with. It made no sense. That evening, while Chloe watched cartoons in the living room, Liam sat at the kitchen table and tried to piece together what might have happened. He had kept meticulous records of his shift, as he always did. He pulled up his personal backup of the night's logs on his laptop and went through them line by line. Everything was in order. The minor fluctuation he had flagged, his routine checks, his notes, nothing that could possibly be connected to a primary server failure. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a cold feeling was beginning to take shape. Something was not right. He thought about Ava Sterling, the CEO he had only ever seen from a distance. She was younger than most executives at her level, maybe 35, with sharp features and blonde hair always pulled back in a severe ponytail. The employees on the night shift rarely interacted with upper management, but everyone knew who she was. She had taken over the company from her father 5 years ago, and under her leadership, Nexus had grown from a regional player to a major force in financial technology. People said she was brilliant but cold, the kind of leader who made decisions with her head and never her heart. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that Ava Sterling had been in the building that night. She had been working late in her office when the system failure occurred, and she had come down to the server floor to assess the situation personally. She had walked past Liam's station at approximately 2 in the morning, while he was reviewing the notification about the backup server fluctuation. Their eyes had met for just a moment, and then she had moved on, her heels clicking against the polished floor. In that brief exchange, neither of them had spoken. But Ava had seen the document on his screen, and in the chaos of the hours that followed, when executives were screaming for answers and the IT director was scrambling to assign blame, that small detail had become a convenient anchor for a much larger lie. The call from Human Resources came on Monday morning, just as Liam was dropping Chloe off at school. He listened to the voicemail in the parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. They wanted to see him at 2 o'clock, a formal meeting. He should bring any documentation he felt was relevant to the incident. The words were polite, professional, but he could hear the undercurrent beneath them. He was not being invited to a conversation. He was being summoned to a trial. He spent the next few hours gathering his records, printing out logs, organizing everything into a folder that felt pathetically thin against the weight of what he suspected was coming. At 1:45, he walked into the Human Resources office on the 4th floor of the Nexus building. The room was beige and sterile, decorated with motivational posters that seemed to mock him. And there, standing beside the HR director's desk, was Ava Sterling herself. She did not look at him when he entered. Her gaze was fixed on a tablet in her hands, her expression unreadable. The HR director, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, gestured for Liam to sit down. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice carefully neutral. "We've completed our preliminary investigation into the server failure that occurred last Thursday night. The report indicates that a monitoring error in your sector may have contributed to the delayed response time." Liam felt his heart pounding in his chest. "That's not possible," he said, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "I logged everything according to protocol. The fluctuation I noted was in a backup server, completely unrelated to the primary system that failed." He reached for his folder, ready to show them his documentation, but Ava Sterling finally looked up. Her eyes met his, and he saw something there that surprised him. Not anger, not accusation, something closer to resignation. "The company has already made its determination," she said, her voice flat. "The evidence in the official report is conclusive." Liam stared at her. "Then, let me see the official report. Let me show you my logs. There's been a mistake." Sandra shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Mr. Carter, the investigation was thorough." "I want to see the report," Liam repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I have a right to see what I'm being accused of." A long silence filled the room. Ava's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The report is confidential," she said finally. "But I can assure you that the decision was not made lightly." There it was. The wall. Liam had worked enough jobs in his life to recognize when the fix was in, when the decision had been made before the meeting even started, but something in Ava's demeanor gave him pause. She would not meet his eyes. Her hand, resting on the tablet, trembled slightly. For someone delivering a verdict, she seemed almost as uncomfortable as he was. The door to the office opened, and a small figure appeared in the doorway. Chloe. She must have been brought from the company daycare, where she sometimes stayed when Liam had meetings. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Daddy!" She ran across the room and wrapped her arms around his waist, oblivious to the tension in the air. Liam hugged her back, his throat tight. "Hey, sweetheart. Give me just a minute, okay?" But Chloe had already noticed Ava standing there. She looked up at the CEO with curious eyes, the way children do when they are trying to understand something that does not make sense. "Why does Daddy look so sad?" she asked, her voice small and clear in the silent room. Ava Sterling's composure cracked, just for an instant. Something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like pain. Then she turned away, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked toward the door. "We're done here," she said without looking back. "HR will follow up with the formal documentation." And then she was gone, leaving Liam holding his daughter in an office that suddenly felt like a cage. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Liam went through the motions of his shifts, but he could feel the weight of suspicion following him through the building. Coworkers who used to chat with him during breaks now avoided his eyes. His supervisor spoke to him in clipped sentences, as if prolonged contact might be contagious. The company had not officially fired him yet, but the message was clear. He was already gone in every way that mattered. Then, on Thursday evening, something unexpected happened. Liam was alone in the break room, staring at a vending machine sandwich he had no appetite for. When a young man in an IT uniform approached him, Liam recognized him vaguely. Kevin, one of the junior system administrators who worked on the floor above. "Mr. Carter," Kevin said, glancing around nervously. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Liam shrugged. "Sure." Kevin slid into the seat across from him, keeping his voice low. "Look, I don't know if this matters, but I found something. Something that doesn't add up." He pulled out a flash drive and set it on the table between them. "The official report says the failure originated from a monitoring error in your sector, but I pulled the actual system logs from that night, the raw data, before it was compiled into the report, and the failure signature doesn't match your station at all. It matches a configuration change that was made on the primary server itself by someone with administrative access." Liam felt his pulse quicken. Who has that kind of access? Kevin's face was pale. Only the IT director and the C-suite executives. And the log shows the change was made at 1:47 in the morning, right before the cascade failure began. He pushed the flash drive toward Liam. "I don't know what's going on, but someone signed off on a report that contradicts the actual evidence, and that someone was the CEO herself." Liam stared at the small device on the table. His mind was racing, trying to process what Kevin was telling him. Ava Sterling had signed the report. Ava Sterling had seen him that night, had walked past his station, and now, according to these logs, she had authorized a document that blamed him for something he had not done. Why? What possible reason could the CEO of a major technology company have for framing a night shift technician? He picked up the flash drive. "Why are you showing me this?" Kevin looked away. "Because my mom worked here 20 years ago, before Ava's father retired, and she was let go after a similar incident. Blamed for something she didn't do. It destroyed her career." He stood up. "I'm not saying the situations are connected, but I think you deserve to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you." That night, Liam sat in his car in the parking lot outside Chloe's school, waiting for her after-school program to end. The flash drive felt like a bomb in his pocket. He had spent hours reviewing the files Kevin had given him, comparing them to the official report that HR had finally provided. The discrepancy was undeniable. The failure had originated from an administrative-level configuration change, not from any monitoring error, and the timestamp placed it squarely during the window when Ava Sterling had been on the server floor. Someone had made a mistake. A serious one. And instead of taking responsibility, they had chosen to sacrifice Liam Carter. The passenger door opened, and Chloe climbed in, her backpack bulging with art projects and homework. "Daddy, I made you something," she announced, pulling out a construction paper card covered in glitter and crooked hearts. "It says, 'Best Dad in the World.'" Liam took the card with hands that were not entirely steady. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I love it." She beamed at him, and for a moment, the weight on his chest lifted slightly. Whatever happened next, whatever he decided to do with the information Kevin had given him, this was what mattered. This little girl who believed in him, who trusted him, who deserved a father who stood up for what was right. "Chloe," he said slowly, "do you remember the lady we saw at Daddy's work, the one with the yellow hair?" Chloe nodded. The one who made you sad? She didn't mean to make me sad, Liam said, though he was not sure if that was true. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes they don't know how to fix them. Chloe considered this with the solemn gravity only a 7-year-old could muster. Mrs. Patterson says, when you make a mistake, you should say sorry and try to do better. Liam smiled despite himself. Mrs. Patterson is a wise woman. He started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, his decision crystallizing with every mile that passed beneath the wheels. Tomorrow, he would walk into that boardroom and demand the truth. Not for revenge, not for anger, but because some lies were too heavy to let stand. The executive boardroom on the 12th floor of Nexus Technologies was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Denver skyline. A mahogany table stretched nearly 20 feet long, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than Liam made in a month. When he walked through those doors on Friday afternoon, uninvited and unannounced, every head in the room turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Ava Sterling was seated at the head of the table, reviewing documents for the quarterly restructuring plan. The board members flanked her on either side, a wall of expensive suits and practiced disapproval. "Mr. Carter," Sandra from HR said, rising from her seat near the door. "You can't be in here. This is a private meeting." But Liam did not stop. He walked to the center of the room and stood facing Ava, his heart hammering in his chest but his voice steady. "Why did you lie about me?" The silence that followed was absolute. Ava's pen stopped moving mid-signature. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment something flickered in their depths. Fear, guilt, recognition. Then her expression hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cool and controlled. "You're interrupting an important meeting. Security will escort you out." Liam reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sheaf of papers, the printouts from Kevin's flash drive. "I'm talking about this," he said, setting the documents on the table. "The actual system logs from the night of the failure. The ones that show the error originated from an administrative-level configuration change, not from my station. The ones that prove someone in this room made a mistake and decided to blame me for it." A murmur rippled through the board members. One of them, a silver-haired man in his 60s named Richard, leaned forward to examine the papers. Ava's face had gone pale, but she did not reach for the documents. "You signed the report," Liam continued, his voice gaining strength. "You were on the server floor that night. You saw me at my station, doing my job exactly as I was supposed to, and then you authorized a document that destroyed my reputation. I want to know why." The silver-haired board member looked up from the papers, his expression troubled. "Ava, is there something you need to tell us?" Before Ava could respond, another board member interjected. A younger man, maybe 40, with sharp features. "Ava," he said, his voice low and warning. "You promised. No one needs to know about that anymore." Liam's attention snapped to the younger man. "Know about what?" The man's face tightened, but he said nothing. And in that silence, Liam understood that whatever was happening here was bigger than a simple cover-up. There was something else, something buried. Ava stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This meeting is suspended," she announced. "Everyone out." Except Mr. Carter. The board members exchanged uncertain glances, but something in Ava's tone brooked no argument. One by one, they filed out, leaving Liam alone with the woman who had tried to ruin his life. She walked to the windows, her back to him, her silhouette framed against the gray Denver sky. "Do you know who my father was?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam frowned. "Edward Sterling, the founder of Nexus Technologies." "The founder," Ava repeated, something bitter in her tone. "The visionary, the great man whose portrait hangs in the lobby. Everyone remembers him as a genius. What they don't remember is what he did to get there." She turned to face him, and Liam was startled to see tears glistening in her eyes. 23 years ago, when this company was struggling to survive, there was another incident, another system failure that cost millions. And my father did exactly what I did. He found someone to blame, someone expendable. Liam felt the blood drain from his face. A terrible suspicion was forming. Who? Ava's voice cracked. Her name was Margaret Carter. She was a senior technician. One of the best. My father blamed her for the failure, destroyed her career, blacklisted her from the industry. She never recovered. She died 5 years later. She looked at him with eyes full of anguish. She was your mother, wasn't she? The world seemed to tilt beneath Liam's feet. His mother, the woman who had raised him alone, who had struggled with depression and alcoholism for as long as he could remember, who had died when he was 19 from what the doctors called complications, but what he knew was really a broken heart. You knew, Liam said, his voice hollow. You knew who I was when you hired me. Ava shook her head. No. I didn't make the connection until last week. But once I realized, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The same thing, happening again. The same injustice. She stepped closer. Her composure completely gone. When the failure happened, I panicked. The IT director came to me with the report, already blaming you. And I remembered what my father taught me. Protect the company. Find someone who can absorb the damage. I told myself you were just a night shift worker, that you'd find another job. Her voice broke. But then I saw your daughter, and I saw the way she looked at you, and I realized I was about to do to her exactly what my father did to you. The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of pain. Liam did not know what to feel. Anger at the woman who had nearly destroyed him. Grief for the mother whose suffering now had a face attached to it. And somewhere beneath it all, a strange sense of pity for Ava Sterling, who had inherited not just a company but a legacy of cruelty. Before either could speak, the boardroom door burst open. Chloe stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. She had slipped away from the daycare again. Daddy? She ran across the room and grabbed his hand, then looked up at Ava with that penetrating gaze of hers, and she saw the tears. Why is the lady crying? Chloe asked. Liam knelt down. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're trying to be brave. Chloe looked back at Ava with something like sympathy. My daddy says it's okay to be sad sometimes. It means you have a big heart. Ava Sterling, CEO of a billion-dollar company, began to sob. The suspended board meeting resumed an hour later. The members filed back in with wary expressions. What they found was Ava standing at the head of the table, her face composed but eyes red-rimmed, and Liam seated with Chloe on his lap. I have something to tell you, Ava said, about the server failure, about the report, and about a decision I made that I deeply regret. She laid out the truth in unflinching detail. The actual cause of the failure, her decision to sign the falsified report, her father's legacy. When she finished, Richard spoke first. You're telling us you knowingly authorized a fraudulent report? Yes, and this pattern was established by your father, who did the same thing to this man's mother. Yes, Richard leaned back. Ava, this isn't just ethical violation. This is potentially criminal. The younger board member jumped in. We need to consider the company's exposure, if this becomes public. It should become public, Liam interrupted. Every eye turned to him. He stood up, settling Chloe gently in the chair. I didn't come here for money or revenge. I came for the truth. He looked at Ava. 23 years ago, your father destroyed my mother. Last week, you almost did the same to me. If you fire her now, nothing changes. The cycle just keeps repeating. He faced the board. I'm not asking you to let her off. I'm asking you to do something different. Make this company actually worth protecting. The room erupted in murmured debates. Through it all, Ava stood motionless. Finally, Richard raised his hand. We'll investigate fully. Ava, you'll be suspended pending results. He turned to Liam. We owe you a profound apology. The meeting adjourned. Soon, only Liam, Chloe, and Ava remained. What happens now? Liam asked. Ava walked to the window. Now I face consequences. I've spent my life trying to live up to my father's image. Turns out it was a lie built on others' suffering. She turned. Your mother deserved better. You deserved better. Chloe tugged Liam's sleeve. Daddy, can I give her something? She pulled a small tissue decorated with cartoon characters from her pocket and walked to Ava. "Here. For your tears. My daddy says tissues help when you're sad." Ava took it with trembling hands. And for the second time that day, she began to cry. Cleaner tears this time. "You have a remarkable daughter," she whispered. "Yeah," Liam said quietly. "I do." The investigation lasted 3 weeks. Co-workers who had shunned Liam now approached with awkward apologies. His supervisor treated him with uncomfortable deference, and every few days, Ava sent updates, asking if there was anything he needed. She was not a villain, he realized. She was a person shaped by forces she did not choose, struggling to become someone different. The day before the board's decision, Ava called. Her voice was flat. "They're going to remove me as CEO. Too much liability. Is that what you want? It doesn't matter what I want. It's what I deserve. That's not what I asked." A pause. "No. Without Nexus, I don't know who I am." Liam thought about his mother. The years she had spent adrift, unable to find footing after losing her job. "Meet me in the parking garage." 15 minutes. She was waiting when he arrived, arms wrapped around herself. She looked smaller somehow. Without the CEO armor, she was just a woman facing consequences. "You could run," Liam said. "Resign before they fire you. Start over somewhere else." Ava shook her head. "That's what my father would have done. I don't want to be him anymore." Liam studied her. "The board will ask me tomorrow what they should do with you. Whether you should be fired. Whether I want to press charges." Ava's face went pale. "What are you going to tell them? That destroying you won't bring my mother back. It will just create more pain." He took a breath. "What this company needs isn't a new CEO. It needs different leadership, the kind that admits when it's wrong. And I'm going to tell them that if anyone can build that kind of company, it might be someone who understands exactly how much damage the old way can cause." Ava stared at him. "Why would you do that, after everything?" "Because my mother spent her last years bitter and broken, consumed by what your father did. I watched it destroy her. And I promised myself I would never let hatred do the same to me." He met her eyes. "You made a terrible mistake, but you told the truth when you could have kept lying. That has to count for something." The final board meeting arrived Friday afternoon. Liam sat with Chloe beside him, coloring quietly. The board members were arranged around the table. At the head stood Ava, waiting for her fate. Richard cleared his throat. "Before we announce our decision, Mr. Carter has asked to address the board." Liam stood. The room fell silent. "Most of you don't know this, but 23 years ago, a woman named Margaret Carter worked at this company. She was a senior technician. When a system failure cost millions, Edward Sterling blamed her. Destroyed her reputation. Ended her career." He paused. "Margaret Carter was my mother. She died when I was 19, broken by what happened here." The board members shifted uncomfortably. "When the same thing almost happened to me, I wanted justice. But then I thought about what justice really means." He looked at Ava. "My mother spent her last years consumed by anger. She never got justice. She never got an apology. That bitterness ate her alive." His voice softened. "I don't want that for myself. And I don't want it for my daughter. I want her to see that it's possible to be wronged and still choose to move forward." He faced the board. "Don't fire Ava Sterling. Make her fix what's broken. Build the kind of company her father should have built. If you fire her, you're just doing what this company has always done. Finding someone to blame, making them disappear. But the problem isn't Ava. The problem is a culture that taught her lying was acceptable. Changing the CEO won't fix that." The board deliberated for 2 hours. When Richard emerged, his expression was unreadable. "Ava Sterling will remain CEO on probationary terms. She will oversee a complete overhaul of accountability systems. She will personally apologize to Mr. Carter before the entire company, and she will establish a foundation in his mother's name to support wrongfully terminated employees." He turned to Liam. "We'd also like to offer you a position. Director of Employee Advocacy. Your job would be to make sure nothing like this happens again." Liam looked at Chloe. I'll need to think about it. But he was smiling. The company-wide meeting was held Monday. Hundreds of employees packed the auditorium. When Ava took the stage, the room fell silent. She spoke for 30 minutes. About the server failure, the falsified report, her father's legacy of deception, and about Liam Carter, whose courage in demanding the truth had given her the chance to become something different. When she finished, she turned to where Liam stood at the edge of the stage. He walked forward, Chloe holding his hand. "I'm sorry," Ava said, her voice thick with emotion. "For what I did. For what my father did. For the years of pain this company caused your family. I can't undo it, but I promise to spend my career making sure it never happens again." She bowed her head. Chloe tugged Liam's hand. "Daddy," she whispered into the nearby microphone. "I told you she was nice." Surprised laughter rippled through the audience. Then someone started clapping, then another, until the whole auditorium filled with applause for the possibility that people could change, that institutions could be reformed, that truth could set people free. Later that evening, Liam stood alone in the parking garage. Footsteps echoed behind him. Ava approached, looking lighter somehow. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a chance I didn't deserve. My mother used to say everyone deserves a second chance." It took me a long time to understand what she meant. They stood in silence. "I've been thinking about the job offer," Liam said. "I'll take it. On one condition. Every year, on the anniversary of my mother's death, this company shuts down for a day, not a holiday, a day of reflection. So everyone remembers that behind every corporate decision, there are real people whose lives can be changed forever." Ava was quiet. Then she nodded. They shook hands. A promise, a beginning. As Liam walked to his car, his phone buzzed. A text from Chloe, sent from Mrs. Patterson's phone. A photo of macaroni and cheese with the message, "Daddy, come home soon. I saved you the best parts." He smiled and typed back, "On my way, sweetheart." And as he drove through the Denver evening toward his daughter and their small apartment, Liam Carter thought about truth. About how it could destroy and how it could heal. About how the same words that broke his mother had somehow become the foundation for something new. Sometimes the truth does not destroy a person, he thought. Sometimes it saves them. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, it saves everyone.